Canada and Pamela Ritchie, critics of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have argued that opening up Canada's borders to a wider trade partnership could have significant ramifications on our intellectual property rights. Our next guest calls the TPP Pact a Canadian digital policy failure. Joining us is Michael Geist. He is professor at the University of Ottawa, where he's the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. He joins us from Ottawa. Michael, glad to have you with us. We've just heard that this is a net positive. Why do you think it is not for Canada?
Well, I think there's a whole wide range of concerns associated with the TPP that once you drill down into the thousands of pages and you take a look at what we're actually agreeing to, which actually oftentimes is not reflected in even some of the summary documents that the government's provided, I think there's real cause for concern. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing some of Canada's biggest innovators like Jim Balsillie speaking out. I think when you take a look at the core provisions, whether it's on intellectual property, whether it's some of the e-commerce provisions that have implications for privacy and software development, whether it's the cultural provisions, this being the very first major trade agreement that we've ever entered into that doesn't provide a full cultural protection for that entire sector in Canada. I think when you look at that fine print, there really is some cause for concern. And when you layer in the studies that we've seen to date about the economic benefits, which range at best from saying it's a very minor gain because we already have trade deals with many of the largest trading partners in the TPP, to potentially a negative, I think we've got to take a good long look at this and really consider whether or not there is room to change. But if we do take a good long look at this, most business leaders, and I grant you not all business leaders, but most will say, how can we afford to not be in this, even if it's imperfect? Well, I would say there's two things. First off, I think many of the business leaders have themselves still not drilled down into the agreement. I mean, those are business leaders that very often suggested great for the TPP from the day it was announced without actually taking a look at the fine print and seeing the implications. For example, we've had leaders, say, from Ford within the auto sector saying they're very concerned with the implications of this once they had the opportunity to take a closer look. The other thing I think we have to bear in mind is we already have trade deals with the United States, with Mexico, with Chile, with Peru, with many of the largest trade partners. It's not our top three. The European Union is in there, and we have a trade deal that's moving forward there. Really, the only big gain that we have in the TPP is Japan, and we were engaged in active negotiations with a bilateral with Japan, and it's certainly within the realm of possibility to continue to do that. And so I think everybody recognizes...
You also feel that on the digital side of things, and I want you to explain some of these laws that you're concerned about. Tell us what the digital lock rules prescribe and how Canada will have to sort of refocus and change them. What are those and why are they important?
Well, we've seen a number of changes both in the copyright side, the patent side, as well as even some of our border measures provisions that are all contained in that intellectual property chapter. For example, we've got copyright term extension that will extend the term of copyright by an additional 20 years to life of the author plus now 70 years, so that many works will never enter into the public domain in our lifetime. We've had at least one government in the TPP that's taken a look at this, and they say it's going to cost them, that's New Zealand, they say it's going to cost them 55 million New Zealand dollars a year. That's for a country whose economy is 1/9 the size of Canada. If we consider that kind of estimate, and if it's accurate, apply it to Canada, we're talking about a cost on that issue alone in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Then factor in, for example, the costs. So I was going to say, factor in the costs.
Go ahead.
So I just want to make sure that to factor in the costs, let's say also in the Netflix space and in online video where we're moving forward. This is the first agreement that we've entered into that doesn't have a full exception for the cultural sector. In fact, it locks in the ability to extend some of the CanCon requirements that we've seen, that indeed many in the broadcast community and others have relied upon for many years, to the existing players. And so when you get new players who conceivably could put in tens of millions of dollars into the Canadian system, the TPP locks that out. And so the way this gets felt, whether it's on the education side or on the cultural side or on the innovative side, as people like Balsillie are referencing, there's some real concerns. And I don't think anybody's saying, well, there's no gains to be had. If you're a canola farmer or if you sell beef, clearly there may well be some gains. But let's factor in all the costs. Let's recognize we have deals with many of the existing parties. And let's also recognize that even amongst the TPP players themselves, for example, the United States, the prospect of ratification is in some amount of doubt. There are a lot of people having begun to look at the fine print of the deal that are talking about renegotiation or walking away.
Is renegotiation an option at this point? I mean, we're so far down the line, and even if it wasn't crafted properly from several people's perspectives, we've now signed it, we haven't ratified it, but what's possible?
Well, let's be very clear. The government and the minister from the very beginning has made it absolutely crystal clear that signing does not bind us to anything whatsoever. In fact, it's striking that these negotiations that took place almost completely in secret for years, on the premise that, don't worry, once you have the chance to see the deal, we'll have a chance to debate, consult, and consider whether this is something for us. Now there are some who are suggesting, well, we've signed it, clearly we've got to move forward with ratification. It seems to me that the way this was sold, even by the Conservative government, was that there was going to be an opportunity to engage in that kind of analysis and debate. And now that we're starting to see the fine print, I think we've got an obligation to do that. And as countries are doing, as I say, just today, one of the major U.S. senators who used to lead the USTR said he thinks this is a deal that the U.S. should not be ratifying.
All right, we'll have to leave it on that note. Michael Geist, thank you for joining us. Michael Geist is professor at the University of Ottawa.